So having studied what abilities are, we're now moving on to classifications of skill, which again is part of the pink section, acquiring movement skills. We know, for example, that abilities are innate, are stable, and they underpin all the skills that we develop later in our sports. So the specification says you've got to be able to classify movement skills by placing them on a variety of continua. There are actually 6 continua that you'll need to learn. You'll need to understand the characteristics of those continua, and you'll also be able to, or have to, apply different skills, different motor skills, and put them on those criteria. So, in the same way we looked at the characteristics of ability, let's have a think about the characteristics of skills. So what does it mean to be a skill or have a skill? And here's our kind of summary. So the characteristics of skill, importantly, include things like that skills are learned, whereas abilities are innate, you're born with them, they're genetic skills you learn through practice and rehearsal and experience. When performed well, they're efficient, they are aesthetic, as in they look really good, you consistently can do them, so you can repeat them at the same standard. We have quite defined skills. So each sport, you'll probably be able to identify the core skills as part of your sports. You choose to do these skills, so you decide to do them. They're organised in terms of they have little subsections, what we call subroutines, which are organised in the right order. For example, a tennis serve has a number of parts, and we organise those parts to perform that skill, and they're towards a goal. So you do a skill with a certain goal or intention as a result of it. So again, there are different types of skill. You might talk about cognitive or intellectual skills, which is, as it suggests, to do with your brain. So the mental powers of your brain, for example, problem solving or thinking through things, tactical awareness. There might be perceptual skills, so when you perceive things, you take in information from your senses and the environment and you make sense of it and make decisions or perform skills as a result of your perceptions. And finally, obviously, motor skills, so the execution or the smooth execution of physical movements, perhaps as a response to what you perceive in the environment, or perhaps as a response to your tactical understanding. So there are different types of skills. So what's a continuum? A continuum is an imaginary line between 2 extremes. You know, you might have boiling or freezing, and anywhere in between you can have as a degree on that continuum. So it's an imaginary line between 2 extreme places, one end and the other end of a continuum. Now, the 6 classifications or the 6 continua you need to learn begin with these letters, and this is my suggestion for you to learn them, ChemPod. So we will go through each one fairly quickly, but you need to remember ChemPod as an acronym, and then from that hopefully you'll remember the actual continua and what they mean. Here we are. So the C stands for continuous or continuity, and there are 3 parts to that. The discrete and continuous are the extremes, and serial is kind of midway. All the other continua just have 2 extremes. So environmental influence is open and closed, movement involvement is gross and fine motor, pacing is self-paced and externally paced, organisation low and high organisation, and difficulty is simple and complex. So you need to learn ChemPod and what these extremes of the continua are. So looking firstly at continuity, the continuity continuum. As I said, there are 3 parts: discrete at one end, continuous at the other, and serial in the middle. Now you'll need to know what continuity refers to, what does it mean, and you'll need to know the characteristics and examples of each of these 3 elements of this continua. Now continuity actually refers to the relationship between the subroutines of the skill and how defined the start and end point of the skill action are. Let's have a look at some examples and it might become a little bit clearer. So a free throw, like a penalty shot in basketball, is considered quite discrete because it has a very clear beginning and end point. So a discrete skill has a clear beginning and end point. A triple jump would be considered a serial skill because it's kind of part way between these two extremes. There are 3 phases to this triple jump. So 3 discrete phases in a series linked together is a serial skill. So a series of discrete skills put together. And finally, continuous skill is something where there's actually no clear beginning and end. When you're cycling, you've hit this constant pedaling action, right leg, left leg, right leg, left leg. It all interacts and goes into one. So these are the 3 kind of easy examples for the continuity continuum. Moving on to the environmental influence continuum, closed or open skills. Now this environmental influence continua refers to the stability of the environment or how much external factors affect the skill. So a closed skill won't be affected particularly by the environment, and the environment doesn't just mean the green fields around you, it means any external factors. And an open skill will be affected by the environment. So again, let's look at some examples. Passing in any of the major games that you guys play is a good example of an open skill. So passing in rugby would be the example, and it's open, oopsie, wrong order, because passing or the pass that you make is hugely affected by the environment, by the people around you, by your opposition, by your own team. And in order to take all that information in, you have what's called a high perceptual demand. There's lots to perceive, lots to take in, lots to make sense of before you make the decision. A closed skill, so this kind of gymnastics activity, a free throw in basketball, a golf drive off the tee, are not essentially that affected by the environment. He runs his sequence and there's no interaction with other players or other teammates. And because of this, you can rehearse and make these skills habitual, i.e. practice them repeatedly and repeatedly till they become very habitual as a habit. And often closed skills are self-paced, meaning that you control when you initiate them, when you start. So muscular involvement then, the examples that come to mind are something like darts, which would be a fine motor skill because you use relatively small muscle groups and it is very much about accuracy and precision. And on the other end of the continua would be jumping or running, which involves large muscle groups and very little precision. It's large, powerful movements, and that would be considered a gross motor skill. So Kempod, then the P involves pacing. And your extremes are self-paced or externally paced. Do you control it when you initiate the movement, or does something or somebody else control it? So pacing looks at the degree of control the performer has over the movement, i.e. when and how fast they do the skill. Our examples then, a shot put. So you initiate the movement and you control when you do the put. So the performer themselves decides when and how fast. Externally paced, so any kind of competition or race or any of your major games where you're possibly having to catch a ball or make a pass will be determined by external factors, like people in your environment or things in your environment or other boats or the wind or the weather, other factors like this. So the environment again doesn't just mean weather factors or the space around you, it might mean people around you also. The O stands for organisation, so the degree of organisation of the skill. And this looks at the relationship between the subroutines of a skill. So lots of skills can be broken down into smaller subsections, like a tennis serve, the throw, the follow through, the preparation, the ball toss. So all of them are separate little subroutines. Some skills aren't so easily broken down into subroutines. So organisation looks at how easy or how many subroutines can be used, or if it's not easily broken down. Example being a trampolining sequence. So a sequence has lots of parts. Each part would be considered a subroutine. And when you're practicing a sequence, for example, trampolining or gymnastics, you can easily practice the subroutines separately, and you would use the part practice method to do this. Again, a tennis serve is low organisation because there are lots of subroutines. And the way I'd suggest remembering this is low organisation skills have lots of subroutines, the L's, low, lots of subroutines. High organisation skills, for example, a single cartwheel, is quite hard to break down into subroutines. So again, the way I'd remember this is high organisation skills are hard to break down, the H and the H. So low organisation, lots of subroutines, high organisation, hard to break down into subroutines. And because you can't break them down, these skills, for example, a cartwheel down into bits, you tend to have to practice them as a whole. So the whole practice method might be used instead of a part practice method. And then finally, D for difficulty. Now, difficulty refers to how complex the skill is. And a complexity, so a high complex skill or a very complex skill, would make you have to do lots of processing. So it would have a very high perceptual load, lots of information to interpret and make sense of. You might not have a lot of time to interpret these, or you might have time to think about these things. And you may or may not have feedback during the skill. So let's look at examples. A simple skill, for example, cycling, has few subroutines. Feedback isn't necessarily possible or necessary during this skill. There's little brain processing during this skill, and it's not massively affected by the environment. So a shot put actually might be a good example of this. You essentially throw it as much as you can. It's hard to break it down. You don't tend to think and make decisions. You just do it, and you do it regardless of what's going on around you. A complex skill, this end of the difficulty continua, is actually quite related to the environment. So you have to do lots of thinking and processing. So this badminton player would have had to take in the speed of the shuttle coming towards him, the angles that are available, what his opponent's doing. There are lots of subroutines in the smash or the shot that he might make. The timing of these subroutines and the performance matters, and you would need ongoing feedback to make the right decision during this kind of a skill. So simple is pretty straightforward, complex has a high perceptual load. So ultimately try to practice recalling what these different continua are. So the ChemPod refers to the different continua, and you'll obviously need to know then the breakdown. What does continuity mean, or what does it talk about? And what would be the 3 bits of that particular continua? Similarly with E, what does environmental influence actually mean, and what would be the 2 extreme cases, and be able to apply this to motor skills. So you might say a skill, you might have to mark on these continua where you think a certain skill is, and importantly, wherever you put it, you need to be able to justify why you think that. So there's kind of not necessarily a massive wrong to this, as long as you can justify why you think a certain skill is this end of the environmental influence continua. So justification is really important. Maybe just finish by having a think about this example. So a penalty in football, where would it be on the continuity continua? Where would it be on the environmental influence continua? Where would it be in muscular involvement? Where pacing? Where organisation? And where difficulty? Have a think.